I think you all need to put that you got it. Again, my name is Lee Altadonna, president of the Pennsylvania Audubon Council, and I'm very pleased to welcome the many folks who have registered, and hopefully we'll be able to sign in and participate this evening. Again, please keep on mute while the program is going. Allow the speaker to be the one with the active mic. I also would ask that you go to the chat if you've not already done so and put in your name and your affiliation. If it's a Audubon chapter or it's a bird town or college or university, we really appreciate knowing where you're hailing from. We did have a really remarkable array of registrants. People are still registering this afternoon. Again, representing not just our Audubon chapters. The majority of the Audubon chapters have had representatives register. Really pleased with that. And we're also pleased that we have a lot of the bird towns. Pennsylvania Audubon Council has a close affiliation with Birdtown. The Birdtown, Pennsylvania program aligns with a lot of municipalities, a municipality-based program. And there's a lot of information here that could be adapted by bird towns for the municipalities where they are active. Again, colleges and universities. And well, again, I know some people are coming in. Please mute. And with that, I am going to go to the next slide, Connie. There we go. I really want to thank our presenters that were assembled for this program this evening. I think you're going to get a great deal from the presenters here. Alexandria Bowling, we call her Allie. She's the president of Appalachian Audubon, I think until June 30 of this year. And then she will be stepping aside for her successor. Peter Sanger, who's the president of Lehigh Valley Audubon Society and the Acopian Center of Ornithology at Muhlenberg College, where he works, with Dr. Daniel Clem, who is probably really the senior expert on bird collision. Connie Sanchez, with the National Audubon Society Safe Buildings, she's the National Audubon Society Safe Buildings Manager. And Mark Sutherland, we're really pleased to have on board. He's with the Safe Skies Maryland, the Maryland Ornithological Society. And really pleased that Jim Brown from Audubon Mid-Atlantic introduced us. And Mark has some great information about some success at the state level in Maryland that he'll be sharing with us. At this point, we'll be getting on with a sequence of smaller presentations. I will ask that if you would hold your questions till the end, we'll have an ample question and answer period. We'll try to answer all the questions that may come up or try to provide you some guidance from this panel of experts to where you might be able to find more information. And if we're not able to answer your question or we don't get to it, we'll make sure we try to follow up, within the next day or two to make sure we can get you directed to either an answer to the question or a place where you might find the answer. So with that, I want to introduce Connie Sanchez. I know she's no stranger to many of you. Connie has been the bird-friendly building coordinator manager for Audubon. In another part of her work with Audubon in the past, she was the important bird areas coordinator as well with the Audubon Science Program. But Connie, I'll let you take it away.
Great, thanks, Lee. Hi, everyone. I'm Connie Sanchez. I'm the Bird Friendly Buildings Manager for National Audubon Society currently. So thanks for joining us tonight. I'm going to kick things off with just a quick overview of the issue that we're talking about, collisions, and kind of the strategies that we've been focusing on across the country. And then we'll take some deep dives into it with what Peter and Allie and Mark will be talking about. So let me just share my screen. All right. Let's see. How are we looking? Is that good?
There we go. You have the full screen.
Perfect. All right. So we know that birds are in trouble. And, I think so many of you understand that this is a really important issue, that we've lost about 3 billion birds since 1970. And what's contributing to those factors? A number of things, right? So we've talked about climate change, and just looking at particular models, species like black-throated blue warbler predicted to lose about 98% of its summer range with particular models, particular warming scenarios, looking at this right here. So that's pretty severe. And then, of course, urbanization, another factor. So as we think about our built environment, 43% of the US has been developed into a suburban urban matrix. And even where there's available green space, such as in our yards, we don't have a lot of suitable habitat for wildlife. And aside from that, thinking about that fragmentation of green space, we also need to think about airspace as well and what these structures are doing. So collisions, and that's the thing we're focusing on tonight, that's another huge factor that's contributing to this bird population loss that we're talking about. So with collisions, research indicates that up to 1 billion birds may be killed per year in the US alone due to collisions with buildings and structures. And when we think about these collisions, glass and artificial light at night are two of the biggest components that we're talking about when we consider these collisions. And we'll dive into that in a bit more detail with what Mark and Peter and Allie will be talking about. So in terms of artificial light at night, it's confusing to birds, as many of them migrate at night and use light cues like the moon and the stars to navigate. So this artificial light at night disrupts the navigation, draws them off course, leads them to circle in confusion, and leads them to be vulnerable on the ground. Or in other cases, they're drawn in by this beacon effect and they can be disoriented. So a number of ways that this artificial light at night can really impact these birds. And then in terms of glass, this reflectivity and this transparency, birds just don't see glass the way that we do. And they often fly into reflections of the habitat in the sky, or they try to fly through the glass. So you'll hear more about that from Peter. Now, collisions are happening everywhere at all times of the day. So it's really widespread, and communities everywhere are susceptible to these collisions that we're talking about. So, there's this misconception that it's only happening in these high rises in these big cities. But really, when we look at the research, we're looking at these low-rise buildings that are an issue in many cases, in most cases. So once again, we'll hear a bit more from our team. So now, considering all of these things that we talked about, whether that's climate change, the shifting of suitable habitat conditions, fragmentation, and all these hazards that these birds are facing, how do we best help them, right? How do we best give birds a better chance, and how do we give people a better chance? So a number of ways that we can think about this. Creating awareness, building awareness of this issue is a big thing to focus on. So a variety of different ways, whether that's social media, press, media coverage, doing webinars like this, doing panel discussions, reaching out to different sectors, the building and the architectural community, doing demonstrations at nature centers, partner buildings, wherever we can get that visibility. Taking individual action, like looking at your own homes, assessing lighting in your own homes, assessing your yard, your windows, all of these things that you can impact in your own personal spaces, as well as in your local parks and community spaces. And then municipal engagement and focusing on policy legislation. That's another avenue that a lot of teams have focused on as well. And I'm just highlighting some of the successes that you see here, whether that's in New York City, in Pittsburgh, in Colorado, in Philadelphia. So a number of different ways, whether that's local legislation or whether that's just focusing on proclamations and resolutions to build awareness leading up to legislation. And then more packaged programs and specifics associated with that, like lights out programs that many of you have heard about. So some of these involve different aspects, not just promoting lights out, but also collision monitoring, in some cases, along with bird rescue programs, community engagement, thinking about collecting information about problematic buildings. And you'll hear a little more about lights out with Allie. And then another piece of this is utilizing science and technology to truly engage community members in taking action. So offering different avenues to help with community science tools, like what you see here. We've got dBird as well as iNaturalist. And then utilizing what we know about migration to create visualizations that can engage broader audiences in taking action and in really helping on this front. Now, throughout the country, we've got a lot of resources that have been developed. And at the national level, we've worked to compile a lot of those in shared resource folders. So those are available to anyone who's interested in those, and we can share those out. That includes toolkits like what Peter and Lee will talk about later, as well as a lights out toolkit that we've developed nationally, which points to a lot of the resources that were developed locally, fact sheets, magazine articles, videos. So a lot of materials out there to help build programs from the start, as well as support programs as they move along through the process. So just a few examples of focusing on lights out. So this is our lights out network across the country. We've got over 40 cities that are implementing lights out programs, as well as several statewide and regional programs. And, you know, a lot of these involve many volunteers, some monitoring, some wildlife rehab, some municipal engagement, but all of these really involve a lot of partnerships. So I've got this information online on our Audubon website, and it's interactive. So you can click on it and then go to each of these individual websites if anyone's interested in learning more about the different programs across the country. And really, in terms of lights out, it's really gained a lot of traction just in the last several years, with about 14 to 15 programs just have really blossomed in the last several years, looking at this timeline. And this is only representing a subset of the lights out programs since 1999 that where Audubon entities have been involved. So really from the first lights out program in Chicago in 99 to last year, 2022. I wanted to just share with you a couple of examples of sort of how these programs have been implemented. So a variety of ways that these local teams have found success. So in Illinois, in Chicago is the first lights out program starting in 1999. It led the way, you know, with collision monitoring along the lakefront. They've got 30 years of data, huge numbers of volunteers, and really, they've really showcased what can be done with in terms of turning off lights. Recently, there's been a publication focusing on McCormick Place, this building that you see here, and just turning off half the lights in McCormick Place. You know, the authors found that it reduced strikes by 6 times in the fall and 11 times in the spring. So really, that's really demonstrated some effectiveness, but they really had a lot of data to show that. That was 30 years of data that they looked at here. And not many cities can say that. So, but they focused on that approach. In terms of Philly, and I think a number of you probably have heard of this story where it was really sparked by a mass collision event in 2020. Now, there were efforts that were underway before then, but really didn't gain traction in terms of lights out until there was a big media splash and a lot of images showing these dead birds. And so that really launched the program in 2021, that is. So they had a lot of web and outreach materials, a lot of media attention. City Council was involved. They unanimously passed a resolution recognizing the issue of collisions and applauded the efforts of Bird Safe Philly and the Lights Out Philly partners that were involved. So that really made a huge difference in terms of the effectiveness of that program. But what's been critical to success across all of the teams that we've been working with has really been a number of these components. So thinking about partnerships, that has been critical to everything. Thinking about the different perspectives, getting different perspectives in the room, not just the birding community, but really the business community, corporate leaders, government officials, schools, other nonprofits. So astronomy clubs. So all of these things have been really valuable to get to be a part of these initiatives. People have been the foundation of these efforts, getting publicity, getting media attention, and really persistence. It's been challenging, I think, working through all of these things, as you know. So persistence has really been key to everything. Across all the teams that I've worked with, they've really talked about the value and of persistence and really continuing to work hard and deal with these uphill battles in many cases. So I will stop there and let the other team members take a deep dive, but I think I'll turn it back to Lee first. Lee, you wanted to first introduce. All right.
Oh, Lee, you're on mute.
Thank you, Connie. I did want to mention, I just responded to one question. D-Bird is a specialized program that was developed by New York City Audubon, is used by a number of the cities. And it's was designed specifically for monitoring for these kinds of programs, for those types of things. So I know people get confused with eBird. I think the D actually stands for dead bird, which is sad sort of thing, but that's the way it's been used. I think Seattle uses it, New York City uses it. Connie, I don't know if other cities use it as well.
Georgia Audubon uses it as well, and it's really open to anyone that's interested in collecting information about dead birds. So
Right.
anyone can use it even without signing in. And it's similar to iNaturalist, except that iNaturalist requires a login. So it's really just collecting incidental
Karen, you got
information.
other stuff to do?
Sorry.
Oops.
Nope. Make sure you're on mute if you're not presenting. And again, I would just remind folks, if you've not entered into the chat your name and your affiliation, would appreciate you adding that in. Connie, if you can launch, I have 8 slides I just want to quickly share. This webinar tonight is the first of several that the Pennsylvania Audubon Council is looking to sponsor. This one is focused on lights out and mitigating a bird collision because these are 2 of the highest priority conservation issues that have been identified by the chapters here in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Audubon Council is an independent organization. Its members are the chapters of Audubon in Pennsylvania. And we spent most of 2022 into the very beginning of 2023 looking at prioritization of the issues that had the greatest concern across the spectrum of our chapters and across the spectrum of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Next slide. We call them education and outreach statements because we think a great deal of what we can do with these issues is to educate, to reach out to the communities we serve, and then also it becomes a stepstone for advocacy as well. Each of the outreach statements can be found on our website in a flipbook fashion. They are arranged in two different pages for each issue. The first page is a very general overview of the issue itself, and the second is more of a matrix of ways that different components of the network can get involved. And I'll do a little bit deeper dive into that as we get on to the two issues at hand today, mitigation of bird collision and lights out. Next slide. This was the issue. Clearly, you can read it, in terms of bird collision and why it achieves such a high prioritization among our chapters. Next slide. This is it in more detail. Again, no need to read this, but it gives you more background. And the lead contributor to this, although we had many contributors, but Peter Sanger was the lead contributor to this page to pull it together. Next slide. This is what I want to spend a little bit more time on. When we were pulling together the priorities, and not just for these issues, but for all the issues, Jim Bonner from the Audubon Society of Western Pennsylvania noticed that these kind of rolled into a matrix style, local and personal action together at the community level, and action that might take place at the state or federal level. So we designed our education and outreach statements around that kind of a matrix. I think the other thing that's very important here, the boxes and the words that are within them are not prescriptive. They are suggestive. They outline opportunities. And we recognize that not every chapter wants to get engaged in every issue that's here, or there's pieces that they may want to pick up that really fits the area they serve, the communities they serve in Pennsylvania. This doesn't apply just to chapters. If a bird town or a college or university or an environmental advisory council wants to get involved with these, this applies to them as well. It really shows a kind of a scaffolding of ways, suggestive ways, and there may be better ways that a chapter or another organization may think of to get involved. So for bird mortality caused by collisions with glass windows and other reflective surfaces, we look at the working with just the individuals in your own organization, your chapter members, your bird town audience, that type of thing, students at a college or university, where you can talk about the issue, ways that people can get involved to take action on their own, do their own windows at their home or at their school or in their, at their place of business. Working at the community level, can start looking at municipal ordinances. Lights out, we're going to follow this as well when you see the next set of slides. But there are things that can be done with, leads criteria, looking at people that are doing window replacement, potentially to get some kind of guidelines so that full exterior screens are used when windows are replaced. And then, of course, at the state or federal level, we'll hear a lot more of this from Mark. There can be state laws that can be enacted. And of course, there's the potential of federal action as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the program. We can go to the next slide. Artificial light, of course, we just talked about a bit, and Ali is going to go with a little bit of a deeper dive in post-haul what happened in Harrisburg with the efforts that her chapter led there. But here's the issue, and it's not just cities. You're going to find that there are things that can be done about light with Audubon's partnership with the Dark Skies folks. There are some things we can do right around our own homes, even if we're not in the midst of a major city. Next slide. Here's just the larger description. Again, you can go to our website and can read this in more detail. Next slide. And here is the matrix here for lights out. Again, working with individuals on what they can do at home with light timers, lights that go on with timers or motion detectors. Other ways to reduce the use of light around your own home or office building, that type of thing. Again, working at the community or municipal level, dark skies mentioned here, and reducing the amount of artificial light. I know that as a youngster, I still live in pretty much the neighborhood where I was raised. You could see the night sky. On clear nights, you could see the Milky Way. I haven't seen the Milky Way in my neighborhood in years and years. There's just too much light. Got to get out and away from the city to be able to do that. Not just the light pollution, they used to call it, but that's the issue that persists. And then again, at the state and federal level, there are some provisions for some of the Bird Safe Building Act to talk about lighting. It has not been introduced in this legislative session in Congress, but it has been introduced in the past. Again, other kinds of regulations that some cities are adopting or that states might adopt. So that's the Lights Out initiative here. And from there, what I'd like to do is just indicate that Lights Out can be a bit of a stepping stone. It seems to be one that, as I think Connie pointed out, has been really gaining momentum. People jumping on board with it. A lot of them are voluntary programs, and it turns out that it becomes a way to leverage getting individuals involved with doing things where they're windows too. It starts bringing attention to the broader issue of bird collisions with glass that is year-round. Lights Out generally persists with spring and fall migration. And to do a bit more of a deep dive with this, I'll be introducing Ali Bowling, who's the president of the Appalachian Audubon Society, and the Appalachian Audubon Society led the charge to get the Lights Out Harrisburg initiative rolling. Bird Safe Philly and Lights Out Philly had started just a year or so before that, and Lights Out Pittsburgh was one of the first programs in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and that's still going strong. But I know there's interest from other municipalities, and I know Ali has actually reached out to some partner chapters interested to do this in some of the smaller cities, smaller towns in Pennsylvania. So with that, Ali, I'll introduce you and
Yeah, sure.
go from
Let
there.
me share my screen. Thank you, Lee. So give me 1 second here. Okay. And I'm just gonna make it in slideshow. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, there you go.
Perfect. Okay, great. So I'm just going to talk about how Harrisburg implemented Lights Out. Appalachian Audubon Society was a leader in this. As Lee had mentioned, we had many partners. A list of some of our partners is here on the screen. So DCNR, the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, Department of General Services, and others. I mean, the list could go on of great partners that we had to work on this. So I also want to give a shout out to Lee and Connie. They were incredibly helpful through this process. We definitely couldn't have done it without them. So thank you. And I just wanted to say that, creating a Lights Out program is definitely doable. I did this on maternity leave when I had my son. So I was quite busy, but was able to accomplish this. So I feel like it's something that's an easy lift, a good start to the conversation about bird collisions to the community. So I'll just talk about kind of the steps we went through to implement. So the first step that we took was have a foundational meeting. So we brought together applicable stakeholders, whether that was municipal officials, conservation partners, state agencies, wildlife rehabilitation centers. We got everybody together to talk about, what Lights Out is, why it's important, and then determining, hey, we want to do this. So when is a good time to start? So is it spring or fall migration? What's reasonable to kind of kick this off? And what we decided from our perspective was do a soft opening. So we kind of didn't do all of the media outreach in the first spring that we started, but then kind of hit it a little bit harder in the fall. So that worked for us, but that meeting can really help you decide kind of how to proceed. And in that meeting, we decided kind of what buildings we may want to target, who's maybe already working on this kind of effort is, sustainability. Are there LEED certified buildings in the area that we could kind of get some easy wins to start this? And then we created a logo so people would recognize kind of this this thing that we're trying to do. It helps us with kind of media outreach and those sort of things. That is optional. I don't think you have to have one, but I think it can really help you. So then the kind of next step that we did was create some supporting documentation, and Connie Sanchez was incredibly helpful through this because there are templates available. So we created a letter to send to people for engagement. So you can send it to residents, or you can send it to business owners or building owners to kind of get them engaged in what is Lights Out and why is it important? How do they participate? We had a frequently asked questions document available. We had created some social media posts. So this picture is an example of a social media post that we also could be printed out as a poster. Had a QR code to where people could go to pledge. I'll talk about that in a minute. But this was kind of a good starter kit for this program. So like I said, templates are available, not directly to this social media post, but to the letter of engagement, frequently asked questions. You don't have to start completely from scratch. So then step 3, to create a tracking mechanism for people to pledge online, we use Google Forms. It's a pretty simple way to create a checkbox list for people where they can sign up. It's also available for others to use. So it's kind of a template. We can just move the Google form over to your Google Drive. If anybody has any questions about that, I know Google can be intimidating. I'm happy to talk to anybody about that. You could also use Microsoft Forms. It's the same concept where people can just fill it out online. But there are other opportunities, I'm sure, that you could come up with for people to say that they're participating and keep track of how many people kind of join the program. So then the following step was to do more outreach to media. So we did outreach to local newspapers, news outlets, create like a buzz on social media platforms. So I know personally I reached out to like The Berg, which is like a good newspaper in the area that people read, or I was on Good Day PA, which is a local news program. So just trying to spread awareness and get other partners on board. Then step 5 is just to continue to build on this. So when you kick this program off, it doesn't have to be kind of the end goal. You can continue to work on this throughout the lifetime of this program. So continue to do outreach to new organizations, new businesses. We did a program for our chapter to talk about the issues with bird collisions and how to, what Lights Out is and how to solve some of those problems. And so a program for our chapters, give handouts at our events that we do tabling. So there's a lot of continual education that you can do to help build on the program. So I just want to mention a couple of challenges that I think would be helpful to know up front. So people generally have noted concerns about safety from turning off lights. So if we kind of knew that up front, I think we could turn messaging and say that it's only unnecessary lighting. So we're not asking anybody to do anything they're uncomfortable with. Knowing that people were going to kind of react to that, maybe we could have messaged that up front a little bit more, but something to keep in mind. And then just a misunderstanding on the message. So I think having bullet points for your like stakeholders that are helping you start this program, so you're all on the same page of what kind of messaging that you're doing would be helpful, just to make sure that nobody's saying anything that maybe isn't totally correct. And then the opportunities that implementing a Lights Out program gave to our chapter have been really great. So we have engaged with new people and new partners. So the city of Harrisburg just hired a sustainability coordinator, and they came to us as a leading conservation organization in the Harrisburg area, I think because of our work with Lights Out and the partnerships we've created. And so it's been a big game changer for us in our area. And then it helped us grow as an organization. We reached new people. Our program about bird collisions, Lights Out, and bird-friendly buildings was one of the most well-attended programs that we have had. I'd say we had at least 60 people in the room. So that was really exciting. And then it has continued to, so Lights Out is a good platform to start talking about bird-friendly communities. and making bird-friendly buildings and kind of growing on the messaging. So you don't just have to stay at lights out, it can grow to even something larger. So it's a little bit about how to implement a lights out program from me. And I will be available for questions at the end. So Lee, I'll kick it back to you. And I will stop sharing here. Oh, Lee, you're also on mute. You're okay.
So yeah, there we go. Now I'm not on mute. Thank you, Allie. And
Okay.
I did want to mention the leadership of Appalachian Audubon with their website and everything else with this has been remarkable, and also helping with the coordinating the meetings of all these partners. They get it started up. There were not just monthly meetings, sometimes they were more frequent with everybody at the table. And it really helped to get it coordinated. And I know Allie reached out, I think it was the Greater Wyoming Valley that expressed interest in seeing if they could get some initiatives going, I guess, in Wilkes-Barre, and a smaller town in Pennsylvania, but an important town where lights out would work. So there's help like that, and in terms of chapter to chapter support. And I know that that's a big part of what the council hopes to accomplish, is that kind of interaction and support within the chapter network from others that have resources that can be shared or experiences that can be shared to help others to get it rolling. The next part of this is I'm going to be turning this over to Peter Sanger. Peter has been at Muhlenberg College, where, again, some of the most important research on bird collision has taken place. I guess it's about 5 years ago. Peter and I and Keith Russell, with what was then Audubon, Pennsylvania, were able to secure what they called an Audubon in Action grant. And we formed a bird collision working group. And our goal was to specifically look at mitigating bird collision at low-rise buildings. And so the toolkit that was developed, a lot of the training that was developed with a couple of cohorts of people that we were hoping would go out and talk to, service clubs, talk to the local Rotary or Kiwanis Club, talk to the local garden club, talk to your own chapter or other bird clubs to make sure people were aware of this issue, and with some specificity of actions that they could take, actions that didn't require a law of Congress. It didn't require anything happening in the state legislature. It required an individual to be sufficiently motivated to apply a technique to their own windows. And some of them very low cost, some of them a little bit more costly, and quite a variety of things. And Peter's going to talk about that toolkit and about some other aspects of bird collision. Again, this is where, as in Connie's slide, you saw that the great majority of the kills happen. And I will say this again, is that lights out, we're finding here in Philadelphia, the messaging about the issue of glass is becoming more and more prominent and important in the work that the partners with Bird Safe Philly are doing as well. So it really does help to leverage work in that area. So with that, Peter, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. So there. Okay, why is that hidden there? There we go. Is that full screen? Is it full screen, Lee? You're muted.
It
It's
is, Peter.
full screen.
Okay, so this is the first slide in the toolkit that we developed with the bird window collision working group. So I'm probably maybe preaching to the choir here with what we're going over here, but Scott Laws followed up Dr. Clem's work with an advanced statistical package and 30 some years of additional data. And he came up with a median estimate of 599 million birds collide with windows annually in the US alone. You see these numbers thrown around for the whole North American stuff, but these were just for the USA. The scariest thing about it is the error number. So if you know statistics, there's a median, there's a low error and a high error. The low error is 365 million birds a year, which works out to 1 million birds a day. And I use that number because I think anything beyond that is out of people's comprehension. It's too big, and it just sort of defeats getting the message across. So I find it very helpful to just say the minimum average is 1 million a day die in the United States annually. And when you compare it to all other sources of mortality, habitat loss, including climate change in habitat loss, and perhaps cats, glass is pretty much the #1 or top 2 killer of birds that's human related. And as we're talking about lights out, so lights out and the big mortality events that happen in big cities get a lot of immediate attention. And thankfully, like in Philadelphia, it helps motivate some good actions. But the problem is we need to educate people that this is not the core problem. 54% of all collisions occur at low-rise buildings, college campuses, and corporate centers where there's generally vegetation that draws the birds in. 45% occur at residential buildings where individuals can do something about it themselves. Only 1% of collisions happen at high-rise buildings. And for a mass collision event to occur, 3 major factors have to coincide. You need a large concentration of migrants, spring and fall. You need inclement weather to hit them while they're traveling in that vicinity, and the bright lights. The key thing here is I'm not poo-pooing lights out, because lights out, mass casualties in core cities, or this core of the city, doesn't happen annually. I haven't heard of any this year yet. And often we go years without hearing of any. But when you have a lights out program, you prevent the birds that are migrating through the entire region from being confused and dropping down into the urban sprawl around the cities. I mean, think about the core of Philadelphia and how far out suburbia reaches into Philadelphia and New Jersey. And that bright light can scatter tens of thousands of birds into those suburban settings where they run into the glass at our residential homes and low-rise buildings foraging for food. And that's a critical thing that I think is underappreciated with lights out. And it's a perfect opportunity to educate, because lights out gets a lot of media attention, and we can piggyback on that to get the individual homeowners and building owners aware of the problem. So when it happens in a big city, birds fall on sidewalks where they're highly visible. But when they hit windows in suburban areas where there's vegetation, they go unnoticed, uncounted. We don't know, like when Philadelphia had the 300 or so birds killed in downtown, how many, maybe tens of thousands died in the suburban area around it. We don't know, because nobody notices, or they think it's one bird here, one bird there, who cares? But we don't know that number. So as Lee said, we developed a toolkit a number of years ago, what people can do individually and at corporate centers and college campuses. And what we did is a 15-chapter toolkit that contains every single thing that we could think of to educate a totally uneducated person on the problem, to be able to give an intelligent presentation on this. Introductions, checklists, scientific papers, popular articles, detailed information. There's a Swiss publication that goes into a deep dive at every aspect of bird window collisions with key points. And the core of the toolkit is a 72 slide PowerPoint. And it sounds like a lot, but with a little bit of practice, it only takes about 30 minutes to go through it. And there's a complete written out narrative for each individual slide. So you could drag a person off the street and ask them to read the narrative and run through the slides. They would give essentially the same presentation Lee or Keith Russell or I would do without the anecdotal stuff that we know from experience, but it would get the key points across. So this is really, what was the, I'm trying to remember the series of books, sort of the bird window collision talk for dummies. This should not scare anybody. Maybe I'm dating myself with that. Does anybody read books anymore? But anyhow, and also resource material and stuff. And this is, I think, 5 years old, and I'll be working on an update later this year. But anybody that's interested in it, we can give you a link. It's free to download. If you want to modify it, that's perfectly acceptable. We'd like to review the modifications, of course, but there's a tremendous amount of material here, free and open for anybody to use. And that's my slides.
Yep, I will indicate that as part of the toolkit, Peter, you were the primary source of developing a nice handout. It's kind of a 4-panel handout that can be used at, I know a lot of organizations do tabling events or otherwise promote taking steps to address bird window collision. And again, this is something that kind of fits in that matrix that I share with you that you can do with individuals, or you might do with community organizations, schools, and that type of thing. It's amazing to me, and I know some of my colleagues that are involved with Bird Safe Philly, the kinds of buildings that you think would be addressing their windows and have not. Nature centers, environmental centers, and some other locations like that that are aware of the issue really need some support and to take leadership in demonstrating some of these different ways to address and mitigate bird collision. Well, thank you, Peter. And
I was trying to find that brochure quickly, but I couldn't.
well, I know it's in the toolkit.
Yep.
I put the link in the chat.
That's great. Thank you, Connie. Now we've kind of covered a couple of the matrixy boxes, and I really want to hand it off to Mark Sutherland. And I want to indicate that again, thanking Jim Brown from Audubon Mid-Atlantic for making the link. This year, Maryland State Legislature, and it's very different from the Pennsylvania legislature. Pennsylvania has a full-time legislature, a 2-year session. In Maryland, it's a 90-day session. If I have that correct, Mark, if I'm not correct, Mark will correct me. But they get a lot of stuff done in 90 days and a lot of work in between sessions. The other, the other 3/4 of the year that they work on to get some of this legislation in line. But this is a goal, and it's quite an accomplishment. I think Mark has been spearheading this, and it's not something that happens overnight. And we're going to learn a little bit of the experience that Mark had with the state in Maryland that we might be able to take and apply here. I think it's an incentive for us to do something here in Pennsylvania. And I also think that Mark will touch a little bit on some things that are happening or not happening at the federal level. So with that, Mark, please take it away.
Sure. Well, thank you. The first thing I want to do, of course, thank Lee for inviting me. And it's great to hear everything that's going on in Pennsylvania with Audubon. And I'm looking forward to working with you guys in the future. And I'm going to give you a little snapshot of the experience here in Maryland. You can see my slide. Is that up? Good. Okay. Well, Safe Skies Maryland, which is a very small group. We're part of the Maryland Ornithological Society, which is basically the bird clubs. And we're small, but we have a very good group of folks that are laser focused on this issue, bird blast collisions. And for the last 6 years now, we've been working in the state at various levels. We do work, as you have all heard other people describe, with individual citizens for what they can do, with the owners, operators, designers of buildings for what they can do, but specifically with the legislatures, the various folks at the state and local level. And so that's what I'm really focused on today. And when you talk to a legislator, they may be conservation minded. Many of Maryland's legislators are, but they generally think, well, you need to conserve land, we need to conserve water. They don't recognize necessarily that the air is very important, especially for migratory birds. So sometimes I talk about it in that vein. And then you have to hit them with, the big news, and show them something they recognize. Because you have glass, you have bird mortality. And and then you talk about lights being an auxiliary factor, bringing birds into areas where you have glass causes the problem. And then you tell them why it's important. I mean, they recognize that. I think with those two pictures, they say, wow, what's going on here? And you say it's a big deal. As you've already heard, 29% fewer birds since 1970. And then you address the concerns that come up at different times. And one of them is, well, don't the weak and the old die off and get preyed on? Isn't that nature? And you say, no, in this case, you're actually just basically sieving through the air and killing all the animals, including the most healthy, best in breeding condition and so forth. And this happens twice a year. And it's really a big deal. So at that point, you answer those questions. And then you jump straight to the solution. Once you catch them with the fact that it's a big problem, you go to the solution and you say the scientists have worked this out. So it's not like something that a bunch of bird huggers are just caring about. They figured out that birds can see where they can fly through. They understand their size. 2x4 inch rule works for most birds, 2x2 for hummingbirds. It's been worked out through science. And there are solutions out there. There's architectural ways to make those windings visible to birds, and therefore safe and reduce collisions by 90% or more. And so then you go in and say, okay, the science has been done. We understand these solutions, and how practical are they? And then you say, well, actually the green building folks, the architects, the designers, they are part of the solution. They have a lead innovation credit for bird collision deterrence. I mean, it's part of the green building approach. It's been worked out. So again, it's not something that you don't understand. It's something that's already tried and true. You get that point to a legislator, it makes a bigger impact. You can put it on various buildings, and then the question is, well, who's done it? They ask you that question. So, well, actually, right here in Maryland, the National Aquarium has done it, and that's known by everybody. The Maryland Department of Natural Resources headquarters in Annapolis has had a retrofit that we did at Safe Skies. That's actually my wife putting those dots on the window there. And then we jump in and say, well, here's a big example that people know about, and that's the Javits. Because they had a lot of glass and they were killing a lot of birds, but they wanted to have more glass. But by doing bird safe glass, they reduced the collisions by 95%. And then you throw this in, it also reduced the energy used in the facility. And you talk about energy conservation. So if you can link it to something else that they care about, in this case, energy conservation, climate change, less greenhouse gas emissions, you have a bigger impact. So all of a sudden you're building the momentum with your legislators. So here's some examples of things that have happened. Lee already referred to the fact that there's been a federal work on this for quite a while. Mike Quigley in Illinois has introduced for several years a Bird Safe Building Act at the federal level. He sometimes has had a Senate sponsor like Cory Booker. It actually did pass the House twice as part of larger bills in 2020, but it's never passed the Senate. And so Congress changes, it's a different dynamic each year. But it'll continue to be coming up thanks to Congressman Quigley. And it's just an illustration that votes matter because chambers change and so forth. Hopefully we'll get to the point where it can pass the US Congress. But while we're waiting for that, we can do things at the state and local level. Going back to 2013, Minnesota passed the first state bill focused on lighting. So that's been 10 years now. And then in 2021, Illinois passed one that included not only lighting, but also building facades, really what we know is the most important factor. So that's great. We have a state law in place in 2021 that we can point to. There's, when I made this slide, 21 local jurisdictions, cities, mostly in the West and the Midwest, and some in Canada that have laws as well. And there are more every year. So this is, again, for a legislator to know that this has been done, it's being done, gives them a safety level. They don't like to be, out on the scary edge of things. So here's the example of my proof of concept here in Maryland. I live in Columbia, Jim Rouse's planned community in the middle of Howard County, which is in the middle of the state between Baltimore and DC. I went to my councilperson, Deb Young, and said, will you sponsor this bill for me? And she said she would. And then I went to county executive and I said, Calvin, and this is, I'd actually introduced him to this topic before he was even county executive. And he said, I will sign it, but I won't be out in front. You got to get the votes. So what I did was take the information. We had already done surveys and advocacy for a few years. We went to each of the 4 Democrats. The Republican declined to meet with us, got them all to say yes, they would vote favorably to my face, and they did when it came up for vote, and we passed it in Howard County. So that bill and that law now includes both public and private buildings, and the way we got it through was by joining it to the green building legislation that we already had. So it didn't include schools, which is a disappointment, but it was the way to get it through. And the picture you see there at the bottom is the first building that's going up under this legislation, which is the math and athletics building at Howard Community College. And then, okay, so that's what we had done already. So now we're continuing to work at the state level. And another thing that helped us was the fact that Washington, D.C. at the end of last year passed its law, again, dealing with glass. And that was very important, again, showing a neighboring jurisdiction to Maryland. They had a lights out program, like Lights Out Baltimore, for more than 10 years of studies showing that it happens, because people always ask, well, is it a problem here? And of course, we know it's really a problem everywhere, but having that local data is really important. That law will go in effect in 2024. So now jumping to Maryland. So this is where my focus has been the last 5 years, is getting a Maryland law passed. The one that was submitted this year was HB 6. It requires that, all state buildings, new or substantially renovated, or those with state funding of 51%, must meet the lead innovation credit for bird collision deterrence and ABC guidelines. Schools, again, were excluded in the last minute. I'll mention that in a second. The basic provisions are, again, piggybacking on something that's, already codified, which is the lead credit. But we also added the bird ABC guidance because that helps deal with anything that changes in the science. We're dealing with glass here. We're dealing with lighting for existing buildings. In addition, so it's glass on new buildings, but it's lighting on existing buildings. But we had to give them an out. Another thing that legislators will want, well, I don't know what this is like, how much it's going to cost me. And we're saying, well, it's budget neutral. They said, but so we put in the fact that they must meet these standards to the extent practicable and within budgetary constraints. So they have that out. We know it's going to work, so we're not worried about that. But that's the kind of thing that you have to address to get the legislators on board. So how do we do it this year? Originally, Guy Gazzoni, a senator friend of mine, sponsored it in the Senate, and my delegate, Clarence Lamb, also sponsored it, but Clarence was subsequently elevated to the Senate, and so he took that over, and my other delegate, Terry Hill, sponsored it. And so they've been working with me for the last 5 years. It passed the House multiple times with bipartisan votes. That's important. It's not easy to do, but we get a few from across the aisle to vote for it, and they did, but it was not taken up in the Senate in the last couple of years. But this year it was taken up in the Senate, and it passed both houses on the last day of session with 25 minutes to spare. So as Lee mentioned, we have a tight legislative window. Lots of things get done, but you can miss out. And we had missed out in our second year just by a few minutes, but we passed. It had to be gets amended with the schools out. So it has to go back to the House, and all that happens in minutes at the last when they're going through hundreds of bills. So it's quite an exciting as well as nail-biting experience, but we passed it. So we're very proud of the fact that Maryland has it. It was passed by the governor. You must have a good governor. Our past governor might have vetoed this, but we have a new governor with $1 million smile there, Wes Moore in the center, and he signed the bill. And you can see not only myself, but also Jim Brown of Audubon in this picture at the signing. So all that is the history. Let me just sort of codify this with a little bit of lessons learned, which I think will be the most useful for things. I talked about how you really have to think about what a legislature is going to care about, what kind of questions they're going to ask. So you need a champion. And in this case, maybe 2 or 3. So find somebody who'll be a champion for you, because you'll need them. And they'll help give you an insight on how to get others on board and how to get through the process. And that year 1, don't really expect success, because again, this is a new thing for folks. You have to educate the legislators. Even those that are inclined to vote for it are going to want to be a little reticent in year 1. You also need to sit down with the affected party. In this case, it's Department of General Services. They're the ones who build this. And when we actually met down with them and talked about it, we found out, they said, well, we don't do all the buildings. So really, maybe you should do any building funded by the state. And so they actually helped us strengthen the bill. So that was a very productive experience. You need to compromise where I mentioned you have to give them a budget out if they're worried about costs. And you need to use as many multiple paths to success as you can. So by having it in both houses, cross-filing, and pre-filing means early. So both of those things are important. And then how do you get it voted for favorably? How do you get it through the different committees? You have committees, so you have panels for testimony. Make sure that your panel is diverse. In other words, if it's all bird people, they're going to say, well, you're just bird people. But if you have architects, which we had the American Institute of Architects with us from the beginning, we had other folks as well. We built a constituency with some youth, even hunters involved. So being able to broaden our constituency and our testimony is very important. And then in the end, it really does come down to making your voices known. Legislators do care about what you care about if you call or email them. And using Audubon stepped up, Sierra Club stepped up and got us not just the typical dozens that we had before, but hundreds of people contacting their legislators here at the end of session, and including the Senate president, because it turned out he was the hidden barrier, and we had to get to him, and we were able to do that with that. And he said, okay, I see it's important. So that's what I recommend, is that go through all these steps and don't give up, and you can be successful. So with that, I'm going to say we're not finished. We're talking to legislators in all the different counties and cities and stuff is where we can. So we got other people that we're working on. So again, this is a continuing thing because it's the number of buildings that you get under legislation that's what really counts. So you got to work at all these different levels. And with that, I'll just put you my contact information and turn it back to Lee.
Thank you, Mark. And I think the message is persistence, and that vision to get it to happen. I will tell you that here in Pennsylvania, when the Federal Bird Safe Building Act was looking for a Republican sponsor, we worked with the Audubon Policy Office, and we got our chapter leaders in whose chapter territories were in the district offices, included the district offices of Senator Toomey, the Republican senator from Pennsylvania at the time, because we were looking for a Republican co-sponsor that will go along with Cory Booker's bill. We did what we called a full court press. We had visits with each of the offices from each of our chapter leaders. They became aware that there was a full court press, but unfortunately, we were not successful. We were not able to convince Senator Toomey that it was a budget neutral position. We know that probably was his primary concern, was cost. And we were disappointed that we could not, get him to sign on as a co-sponsor and have a Republican co-sponsor. And he was an influential Republican senator at the time. So pretty important to try to get him on. The other thing that just for the folks on this call, one of the important factors is that the county government in Maryland for schools and for government is the primary unit of local government, I would say. That here in Pennsylvania, with our home rule, counties don't have that kind of authority. It's municipality after municipality. And this is where, again, our chapters and our bird towns and the environmental action committees become particularly important in this kind of a process. So it's a big deal. The other federal piece that I would talk about is in appropriations. I know a little bit about the Department of Interior. They had a directive where any buildings that were going under major renovation or were building new needed to put in some bird safe design into those buildings. And that was a pretty important piece. They also got funding as some of this went through from the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, RAWA, and some other types of things that we often work on with a lot of our environmental partners to get funded at the federal level, that they're able to get funding to do some of this work. I don't have a slide for it, but I happen to be visiting the Valley Forge National Historical Park, and they have two major buildings, the Education Center and their Visitor Center, that have these huge glass eruptions that come out of the ground. They're partly subterranean and partly above the ground. And they were all treated with Kaleidoscape. And they told us that that was part of their renovation 2 years ago and accomplished as part of the Department of Interior directive to deal with glass. So there are some other ways to skin the cat, so to speak, to get some of this done. I know that the council, I think it's a conversation we need to have to follow and look at bills like House Bill 6 in Maryland and some other models to see if we can't begin the effort to get something happening here in Pennsylvania. And what happened in Maryland is a real inspiration to try to get something to happen. So hopefully we'll be able to do something as a council and with our other partners to get something done. So
I would just comment, Lee, that both those points are really good ones. I was told by Ben Cardin, who's a senator or retiring senator here in Maryland, that he would work on this, but the key was to have a bipartisan, just to find just one Republican senator. That was the key. And he was working on it himself, working with other bird-friendly things. But again, it didn't happen at the federal level, but we shouldn't give up. We should find somebody that will be a key success, key to success for that. And the other thing is, you mentioned what they're doing at the federal level through Biden's directives and GSA. So actually what we did in our testimony, we got Lance Davis, who wrote the GSA guidelines for bird safe buildings, for federal buildings, to be one of our panel members. So, again, showing that other people are doing it is really important. And so that's good to know. So both of those things are really good. And again, I'm optimistic you guys will have success, and I'm happy to help any way I can.
that's really helpful. That concludes our presentation in terms of the formal PowerPoints. And I think I'm comfortable. I know there's some information that's in the chat, but if there are questions, I'm thinking, I think there's a few of us that if people want to raise their hand, there's that little feature down at the bottom somewhere in my thing that you can raise your hand. But if somebody wants to raise a question, here's what I would. You raise your hand, you unmute yourself, and then you can ask any of our panelists or just generally a question if you have one. Does anybody have a question?
I do. I
Go ahead,
can't
Janet.
find the chat, the
All right,
button to raise
I
my
know who
hand.
you are, Janet. Go ahead. Janet leads one of our bird towns, and she's also on the board of Birdtown, Pennsylvania. There are 41 bird towns in Pennsylvania as we speak. I think there are 6 in Maryland, but it is a municipally based initiative, bird town. So go ahead, Janet.
Yes, well, I want to encourage our township with any of our windows to put on the dots. And I really strongly believe that graphics are very important. And I wonder whether or not there has been a graphic developed that states the reason for those dots. Somebody might look at those windows and wonder what in the world all those dots are for. This is a golden opportunity to inform residents, whoever might be walking by, of the value of what's going on.
Feather Friendly offers a sticker that people can put on their windows that inform people why the dots are on the glass.
Okay. And is there anything larger than that? I go to the Penn Medicine Radnor. They have huge windows with dots that are on 3 different levels. And I always feel like it's a waste that so many people walk into that building and never realize what they're there for and how important they are.
I'll just mention that in one of the nature centers here in Maryland that we did early on, the Howard County Conservancy, we actually did 4 different types of treatments, and we had signage developed. The Bird Club paid for it to tell people what it was. Of course, it's a nature center, so it's an educational center anyway. But I think that could be applied other places. But we basically says bird glass cushions is the problem, and there are solutions. And turn around, and there's one there. And we basically had a Copian bird savers. We had Feather Friendly. We had some do-it-yourself, all done on the same level of the nature center.
Well,
Yep,
may I encourage Audubon national or PA Audubon Council to develop such a sign that we could then download and apply to our windows.
I will also say that Peter, right, I was up visiting Peter at the Acopian Center, and they have a version of the poster that's part of that 4-panel thing, and it's done in a large poster format that explains the issue and demonstrates different ways it can be addressed. But the idea that dots on the windows, I think, what we're looking at, I know some of my colleagues are on the call from our local chapter, Wyncote Audubon, but you want kids to go into a nature center and said, why are there dots on the window? And you go, bang, explain why there are
Right.
dots on the window, and it becomes the opening. So, we can go from there. Freda, if you unmute, I see your hand up.
Hi, this is Freda Tepper in Erie. So when I changed the windows out in my sunroom, I had full screens put in, and there was an incident where the cats pushed them out. And it turns out that the full screens, at least for that particular configuration, and these are locally made windows, the full screens are not secured at the bottom in the same way the half screens are secured. And so I had them replace my screens with, and they did it because of the warranty I had, they did it no charge, but they replaced them with half screens. So I wondered how common that is, and if I'm gonna put in the paracord, do I only have to do it in the part that has, can I stop it before I get to the screen part of the window?
Peter, you're probably the best one to answer that.
Yeah, if the screens are covering half of the window, it's probably bird friendly at that point. The one thing I'll say is, because I had some windows replaced recently, the new screens are garbage. So if a bird doesn't see the screen in time and hits the screen, they're going to hit the glass because there's no rigidity to these new nylon screens and they tear easily. I would just do if you're going to do Acopian bird savers, I would just cut them to the proper length and cover the whole window, but you don't have to.
And the other half of the question was, how common is it that full-length screen is not as secure it's not secured at the bottom where the half screens are secured?
I can't answer that because all my new windows that have screens are only half screens. I think in general, we all can say that anything new isn't any better than what was old when it comes to stuff like that.
Any other questions? I'm waiting the teacher's 30 seconds. Don't see any other questions coming up. I'm
Frida's
hoping.
got her hand up again.
Oh, okay, Frida. Or is that still your hand up from before? That's
From before, but I did previously ask, I think it might have been answered in the presentation, but how common is it that the bird safe windows are actually designed into new construction? And is there cost information involved with that's available to demonstrate whether it's additional cost or not? We just have all these new buildings going in with huge amounts of windows and, nothing's changing.
Peter, again, I know, Walker Glass, there are a number of folks that do this. I know we've worked with some architects that work nationally, based here in Philadelphia, work internationally, but they have done different types of etched glass and fritted glass design on some of the buildings that they've been involved with. I think there was something either you or others shared about the incremental increased cost for getting glass that is treated, either fitted or etched.
Yeah, Jim Cubey is actually the one that worked that up, but I have found it impossible to get a direct comparison between a window built with conventional glass and a window built with bird-friendly glass. And it's maybe lack of effort because of doing other things. But that is something that every time I've spoken to people, there is so little information out there for a direct comparison. I asked our college about it because we just built a building with all bird-friendly glass. And they said the reason they didn't have that information and couldn't get it is they spec'd the building with bird-friendly glass from the start. So they didn't have that information. But regarding that building, half the windows they claimed could not be built with bird-friendly glass. It had to be retrofitted during construction. So it's really a problem and impossible for residential almost, unless you really have a deep pocket and push for it. I don't know many residential buildings that have actually used bird-friendly glass. So it's pushing the manufacturers and the fabricators to get on board.
Yeah,
Right.
Mark, I was going to turn it to you and also to speak to the energy savings piece of it as well.
So as I mentioned before, we had the American Institute of Architects on board, and taking the position that it's budget neutral in design. The idea being is that there's a whole lot of design options that you can do with the building. And as Peter said, if you spec it for that, you can do it, and it really is not a significant cost difference. If you have, but we did get the question, we said, well, what if we've got a building where we've already designed it and you're going to just switch out the glass? And it depends on how much more. Is it going to cost 15% more, 25% more, or whatever it would be? So we took conservative numbers, and for this particular courthouse building in Maryland, we said, okay, you've already designed it, but if you were to make it bird safe, what would it cost? And glass would be a little more expensive. But if you use really cheap glass, it's more expensive, but most people don't do that anyway, because they want glass that's going to be energy efficient, it's going to reduce heat gain and stuff like that. So it's similar in price. But anyway, we said if it did cost more for this building, it would actually work out to be 0.125 the cost of the building. So it's a small amount. Of course, it will get zeroed out in cost engineering if they do it that way. But the idea is to spec it in and to give different kinds of options. And it really is relatively smaller. And I think, as Peter said, Jim Cubey's done it for residential and talking about, ultimate cost and how much, things are as far as, what you pay monthly and all that kind of jazz. There's a lot of ways to attack it, but we just took the approach in our testimony that it was budget neutral if you spec it in. And that's what happened here, in Maryland. Again, we've done this new MAC building is going up, and there's some companies, a lot of the architects like the idea because, again, architects like to design to criteria. You put this one in there and they figured out how to do it. And hopefully we'll have more data now that we've got a place where we're going to be building these things more and more. We'll get some of that better data. I'm actually working on the MAC building to see actually how that worked out, but I don't have detailed numbers at this point.
Thank you, Mark. Are there any other questions? I know some people have left the Zoom, but if there are other questions here, I know there was one from Kelly O'Hara about not related to the it could be related to bird collision, but there seems to be a significant amount of smoke in the air from I don't know how far into Pennsylvania it's going, but I know New York and Philadelphia, Allentown, people are noticing. I think it's smoke from the fires in Nova Scotia that are cycling in here, and didn't know whether, I think Kelly's asking if that would have a bearing on any issues with bird collision. I think the major thing is that most bird migration is over. Birds are breeding at this point, or they're on their breeding grounds for the most part. So I don't know whether or not the the atmospheric conditions are really going to have an unfavorable influence on birds and bird collision tonight.
Yeah, my wife said that apparently you cannot see the New York skyline right now. And like I told you earlier, I can look out my window and see it visually and smell it even in the house now.
You're talking about the smoke, not the New York City sky.
Yeah,
It's,
not
it's
Hoboken,
definitely,
New Jersey.
it's definitely hazy in Harrisburg even.
So it doesn't really have an answer for you, Kelly, but I think the bulk of passerine migration is past. If there are not any other questions, or if you have some afterwards, I do want to indicate that if you're in a chapter or a municipality that is thinking about getting something like this started locally, or even reaching out to individuals that are part of your membership, or the circle of influence you have as a bird town or as an Audubon chapter, really circle back to some of us. And I think some of us will be circling back to Mark so that we can use some of his experience to see what we can get rolling here in the General Assembly in Harrisburg.
And I'll add in that anybody that wants to use the toolkit, if they want to do a Zoom meeting with me, and I can go through the whole toolkit. Before COVID, Keith and I used to do half-day programs in person to train people on the toolkit, because there's a lot of outside information that helps and little insight from working on this project for years, and more than willing to help.
That's great, Peter. All right, with that, again, I want to thank our presenters who've been involved, and I'm hoping that everybody thought this was valuable. We're going to look for some further rollouts on some of the other education and outreach statements. I believe we're going to be doing something on single-use plastics in the near future, and we'll roll that out and work with some of our other conservation partners to get that word out as well. So with that, thank you, everybody, and good night.
Thank you, Lee.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lee.